Okay, well, thank you for talking to me. This is exciting.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So I'm not sure where exactly we should start because I have a lot of like unrelated topics, and I even asked this Discord server like what they want to know as well. So like we got a lot of questions. So I don't know. Do you have a specific place you want to start? Or no. Sorry. Bad intro. Who would you say you are? Like how would you describe yourself?
I I just post sexy pictures on the internet, really, and occasionally post perspectives on things on Twitter as well. I don't know. There's frankly not too much to me. I feel like it's a bit of much ado about nothing.
Hmm. I see that. I see that. Although I'm not sure. I feel like I don't know. Much ado about nothing is an interesting like conception, I guess. But okay, so fair enough. You do, OnlyFans, and then let me see. Okay, so uh, speaking of your perspectives, recently I saw some controversy about you on Twitter regarding your estrogen statement. Uh, I was curious if you wanted to like talk about that at all, or like what you meant, I guess.
Am notoriously controversial. I think I said that estrogen was not that effective, right?
I think you did say
Is that
that.
what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so estrogen is not that effective is a term that is meaningless without context, because if someone says estrogen is going to turn you into a dragon and I say estrogen is not that effective, that's obviously true. So I think we probably need to back up to the statement preceding it, which I think had to do with weight distribution. So my contention is fundamentally that if you take estrogen, you're probably not going to get a weight distribution that is identical to a cis woman's. And to the extent that you do get it as similar as you can to a cis woman's, that's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
So most people who are on estrogen are probably, they haven't been on it long enough to get that kind of weight distribution.
Yeah.
And so my recommendation for people is not to view gaining weight as a method for, I think I say, quote unquote, getting hot, which is, frankly, that's not like a super extreme position, I don't think, because if you gain weight and you're not gaining weight in a way that is identical to a cis female, and even if you are, I think there's probably good reasons to think that it'll look worse on a male skeleton. But to the extent that you gain weight and are gaining weight that is going to places associated with male fat distribution, it's not going to look as good on you. And this, I think, is enormously controversial.
Apparently it is. Apparently it was definitely making its rounds. I guess I am curious if you think that there's like a certain point in a transition where like the fat distribution patterns would switch. Like obviously, neither of us are doctors, scientists, but like I don't know, just based on that controversial statement, I'm curious if you have any like further thoughts about it.
I don't. So, unfortunately, this is something that I'm not sure if like people have really looked into this, studied this. Maybe someone out there has a better idea than mine. So when I talk about this, all of my language is pretty couched in uncertainty. I'll say things like, it will probably do this, or like, it won't do it perfectly. And that's really because I'm uncertain. I think we can use other physiological changes as benchmarks just to set a baseline expectation. And studies on differences in muscle and strength, those have been looked into, I think, fairly extensively in the context of sports medicine. There's this whole debate about trans athletes, and central to that debate is how much muscle loss occurs, as well as, I think, a variety of other physiological changes, which are important. But we know that even years after transition, muscle is not identical to cis women in trans women. And in some sense, I think we can expect muscle loss to be like pretty consistent. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think pretty much every trans woman I've ever met can attest to the fact that you lose a lot of muscle on estrogen.
Yeah.
Weight distribution is so bound up in genetics and hormone levels that I feel it's unlikely that it is more consistent or reliable of a change than muscle loss. I might be wrong about that. So again, introducing uncertainty. But my expectation is that if muscle changes are not identical to a cis woman, even years after transition, I don't think that weight distribution would be the same. So that would be my kind of baseline for this. And I think a reason why we should expect weight distribution to, at the very least, take a while. Another reason to think this is that when we look at adipocyte hypertrophy, which is, I guess, the technical term for the process of fat cell enlargement and multiplication. When we look at that, it seems like one mechanism for how weight is distributed on the body is where existing fat cells are. So it seems like what happens when you consume excess calories is your body decides where to put those excess calories based on signals sent from fat cells. So wherever you have fat cells is more or less where they're going to multiply and enlarge. Again, I should preface this saying I'm not a biologist, so perhaps someone in the comments of this video can correct me, and I encourage anyone to do so because I'm explaining it to the best of my knowledge, but I'm not a biologist.
Yeah.
My understanding is that these fat cells are involved in the process of signaling where fat is distributed. So what that means is that fat will tend to go where fat is. And if you are not on estrogen for a long time, if you live most of your life on testosterone, you're going to have a male fat distribution to begin with. So what I expect is that estrogen will change that distribution, but it's just going to take time. And my other understanding is that fat cells, they last a long time. Their life cycle is something like 10 years. So if you want all your fat cells to turn over and be replaced, that's going to take at least a decade. And in that meantime, you might still be developing some fat cells in male distributed weight areas, disproportionate to what a cis woman would. And I think for all of those reasons, I think we should just be realistic about what weight distribution is going to do for you. And that is to say that weight distribution is not a panacea. It's not going to give you the proportions of whatever your favorite porn star is.
Okay, fair enough. I definitely agree that like adding weight onto your body isn't like guaranteed to be a good thing or a bad thing.
That's true. And another key point here is that like if you like how weight looks on your body, you shouldn't listen to me. Like you should just gain weight or lose weight or whatever. Like people vary in their preferences for how they like weight, and to the extent that weight goes in one place or another, that varies to a high degree individually. And so like more about your body than I do. When I speak in generalizations, it's not always going to be applicable to you.
Of course, of course. One thing I would be interested in, again, like I'm not necessarily asking you, but more so throwing it into the aether for anybody in the comments, would be to understand what you were saying in terms of like fat sticking to fat, and then like combining that with the idea of like breast growth, or like the actual changes that have happened. Because I don't know, actually, let me ask this first. How long have you been transitioning, or like what's your like general journey, I guess? Like
I've been transitioning for about 8 years, I think, maybe coming up on 9 years. So it's been a little while.
and you started when you were 15?
When I was 14 or 15, yeah. So I came out when I was 14, but I didn't start puberty blockers until I had turned 15. But yeah, I came out in a really odd way because I discovered like a paper on, I don't want to say like blanchyism. It was a kind of typology of transsexualism that I
Mhm.
discovered, and it got me interested in the science. And I was like, oh, a lot of the experiences that are being described in this paper kind of describe my own experience. And
What was the
came out
paper,
from
if I
there.
can ask?
I don't remember. I
Oh my
may have
gosh.
posted it elsewhere. It's pretty old, but I think it talks about like type A and maybe like type B transsexuals,
Mhm.
and maybe even type C as well. But it's funny to look back on now that I have a lot more context, and to realize that the types described in the paper broadly aligned with like Blanchard's ideas. And the type that I felt really resonated with me was the type that is like more similar to EGP. So I could probably find that. I think it's in my phone notes. But yeah, I'll look for that.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of blancardism and AGP, people do want to know how you feel about the AGP, HSTS, if you identify with any of the terms. Let's see, did they ask anything else about this specifically? No, those are the specific AGP questions. So, how do you feel about Blancard and his typologies?
Uh, well, let's see. I mean, I think there's probably weaknesses with the typology. I mean, it's something that Blanchard just does not have a lot of money or institutional backing to explore these ideas. So I think that they probably could use refining. And I'm not one of these people that's like a diehard Blanchard person. I think that AGP as a term is like broadly descriptive of my experience. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing or something to be stigmatized. I mean, I think it's kind of just a fact that I experience some level of autosexuality. I think a lot of trans women do. And I think people tend to be pretty scared of admitting that, because it seems like if you do so, you're in some way like forfeiting something. It depends on what you believe in. Maybe forfeiting your right to identify as a woman, or forfeiting your right to take hormones or exist in public spaces. I think it varies depending on who you ask what they feel like they're forfeiting. But I think there's this broad sense that if you admit that there's some sexual impulse, then it perverts the entirety of your motivations. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I actually really resonate with you saying that, because I agree as well. I also resonate with various aspects of like this idea of AGP or what he talks about. And when you really boil down what he's saying, he's not even really stigmatizing it, and he even still suggests like transition as like the cure or whatever. Um, so I find your viewpoint on that interesting. Um, but you say you identify as AGP, so that I now unfortunately, I know a little bit too much of the typology. So would you identify as like an ace AGP, a transient AGP, or like what kind of AGP do you identify as, roughly?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And I feel like it gets to the heart of maybe one of my criticisms with Blanchard's typology, which is that I feel it is in some ways too restrictive. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I have genuine attraction to men in addition to attraction to women. And
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't feel like it is fully meta attraction. I think that's the term. I can just speak to my own experience, but I think I tend to be someone who's pretty good at honestly evaluating their own emotions. And when I'm attracted to men, it doesn't feel like it's totally in self-reference. I mean, I can like look at attractive men and not imagine myself at all, but still find them, attractive or sexually interesting.
Yeah.
So I feel like among trans men I've talked to, I don't think that that is such an unusual experience. I think it's one of the reasons why people maybe are so unwilling to consider the typology, is because in some ways, like, it makes these grand sweeping statements and tends to be pretty hard line about them in ways that just like don't match people's experiences.
Yeah.
So when we talk about these things, I think it's important to recognize that like these are theories, and they're not they're not set in stone. And just because someone thinks that, you know, a part of the theory resonates with you doesn't mean that you have to sign on to every tenet of it.
Yeah. Okay. I definitely agree with that. Um, so I guess following up on that, would you say you're primarily attracted to men, or would you say you identify as like bisexual, or like how would you rate your attraction patterns, I guess, for lack of a better term?
I would say I'm primarily attracted to women and then
Well,
secondarily attracted to men.
you said primarily to men and then secondarily to women, or primarily to women and secondarily to men?
Primarily to women. I don't know if I
Mhm.
misspoke, but yeah, primarily to women.
I just couldn't hear you. Sorry, the Discord cuts out on my
Oh,
computer
it's all good.
sometimes. Interesting. Going back on your mention of autosexuality, I'm curious if you've happened to have read Phil Illy's book, Autoheterosexuality, and if you have any thoughts about that. Just like what, because you mentioned the term.
I haven't. To my great shame, Phil Lilly actually sent me the book prior to its publication, but I was just too busy, wasn't able to get through to it.
Yeah, I read
But
parts of it, but
yeah, I mean, I've seen interviews and I mean, there's one idea that I found particularly compelling, which is
Mhm.
just the idea that autosexuality has this phase of sensual love or passionate love, and then a phase of more companionship love. I think that a lot of trans women have the experience of starting transition, and it inflames the passions of autogynephilia initially. But after a year or 2 years, that doesn't exist. And in fact, in that time period, within the first 1 or 2 years, the feeling of AGP declines a lot. Part of that is taking estrogen and it kind of nuking your sex drive. But I think another part of that is that it becomes much more similar to a kind of companionship love, which again, I think speaks to the fact that when we're talking about AGP, it doesn't have to be a matter of kind of gross perversion. It can be a kind of deep and romantic love for the embodiment of an ideal. And I think in some sense that is a manifestation of a greater human desire to achieve things and to reach for a kind of perfection and a kind of aesthetic idealism. And I think that's something that can be celebrated rather than stigmatized.
I like that. I like that way of looking at it, and I like that that resonated with you. Um, let me see. Oh yes, so transmaxing. Do you have any history with that, or like how did you end up in the manifesto there?
Frankly, I have no idea. I think someone sent me the PDF or something, or I was getting Twitter DMs where people were like, "You're in the manifesto," and it's cool. And I think maybe I just like checked it out and I was like, "Huh, I am," because I think when people told me that, I didn't even expect it to be true. I was like, they're probably mistaking me for someone else. But yeah, I am, and it is a picture of me that I think comes from the Reddit's trans timelines, which, if I'm correct, I'm probably the top or second. Oh, maybe not anymore. Oh no, okay. I am the second most upvoted post on that forum of all time, which is quite surreal.
That is very surreal. How does that make you feel?
I mean, it's very weird, right? Because I think it speaks to this broader pattern within the trans community and my interactions with it, which I alluded to earlier when I said there's kind of much ado about nothing. In the sense that like I'm looking at this picture now and it's a good picture of me. And I was like 18 years old. But also I know that like I have other pictures of me at this time where like I did not look good. I looked like very masculine. And so I think that so much of the trans experience is kind of defined by this gap between appearance and reality.
Mhm.
And that gap informs a lot of the neuroses we have around passing and around how our community perceives us and how we interact with the world, whether or not we consider ourselves women or not. And also why people have kind of been so interested in me historically, despite the fact that I think I'm somewhat unexceptional. I think it's because I take like occasional photos like this where I just look, I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't even think I look like that. There's much prettier people on this forum. It might just be that it's like, I was 14 maybe. So it's kind of like I was a fairly early transitioner. And maybe it's that I look maybe like ordinary in a way that is kind of achievable, and people can project themselves onto me. And I think maybe for all those reasons, like people kind of attach themselves to this picture and they see like this young kid who's got like a kind of scowl and this greasy hair and chapped lips, and he's looking at the camera kind of ominously. And then they see this young woman and they think, oh, that could be me. Like, I was that kid. I was that nerdy kid who didn't take good care of their appearance. I could be an ordinary looking girl. And maybe that's quite appealing to people.
Yeah. Is it weird to I don't know how to ask this, but like obviously, you've made a career out of being online through OnlyFans, through, you've streamed, you've made YouTube videos. I guess, how do you feel being so heavily perceived? Is that like a weird question? Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. I think, I don't know, being perceived is something that a lot of people want until they get it. It's a little bit like fame or money or something, where when you look at it from the outside, you kind of see a lot of the positives, but you don't really see the negatives. When I was 19, I remember name searching on 4chan for myself constantly. And there were periods where every day of the week there'd be a new thread about me, and it'd be full of people just like tearing into me, into my appearance, into, my opinions, beliefs, more so my appearance at that time. And when you're a 19-year-old, that can be really hard. And I think that it forced me to develop a resiliency and a thick skin, and also the ability to kind of not care what people are saying about you. But it also made that time in my life really hard. Like, I had people who were like coming to my parents' house and like threatening like my sister as well.
Really?
Yeah, and threatening to dox me. I had someone who was like paying people for my dox information. And I think it's hard to deal with when you're a teenager.
Definitely. I would imagine that's hard for most people.
Yeah, for sure. I think it forced me to grow up in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, I think it caused me to kind of be jaded and fearful in some ways as well. But I think ultimately, I think I've grown from my experiences, and I'm a better person for them. But yeah, I think that it's been hard as much as it's been good.
Yeah. If you could go back, would you do it again? I'm assuming the income tips the scale in a direction, but like, given everything you've gone through, or like, yeah, would you repeat it if you could go back and do it again?
There's this analogy that I sometimes use for transition, and I think it probably speaks to this question in a broader sense, which is that I've often felt like transition it began with me standing on one side of a door, and people on the other side were telling me, you need to come through this door and get what's on the other side, because it's going to make your life so much better and you're going to be so much happier. It's going to be great. And I look at this door and I inspect it and I say, hey, this door is covered in needles that are going to inject you with like a pain serum as soon as you walk in. And it's going to be brutal and hellish and awful. And they're like, oh, no, it's fine. Like, yes, it's going to be bad. Transition's going to be hard. But once you get on the other side, it'll be totally worth it. And so I'm like, okay. And then I go through, and it turns out that on the other side is like a cupcake or something. It's like a small benefit.
Yeah.
And I eat the cupcake and I'm like, this is pretty good, but it wasn't worth going through that experience. And then people are like, well, why don't you go back? Like, why don't you just leave the room? And that would involve going through all of these painful needles all over again.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm not, I feel like people like misunderstand me when I say like, I wish that I hadn't transitioned, or like, I feel like transition didn't work out as well as I'd hoped, where they're saying like, why don't you detransition or just go back? And it's like, well, because I am in a better place now, but I'm making this evaluation based on a calculation of cost and what I had to do in order to get here. So yes, I'm better off, but was it worth all the sacrifices? I'm not sure. So I think maybe that kind of, I feel similarly about being so public online, where I did it and it was a benefit. But I think that in hindsight, life would probably be easier if I didn't. And now the cat's kind of out of the bag.
Yeah. What would you have done otherwise? Like, did you have a dream?
Not really. I mean, I come from, like, I grew up poor. I did not have a lot of money growing up. And so there was never like a big expectation in my family that I would do one thing or another. And I'd never really had like a lot of guidance in those things. And so, I went to college, but
What did you go for?
I got a degree in business administration, which, I had no idea what I was going to do when I enrolled in college. I went to the first school that would give me a full ride. And I was terrified of going into debt, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I said, all right, I'll take a degree that probably can be applicable with whatever I'm doing. And so I got kind of not the most useful degree, but of course, like every degree, everyone who goes through college goes through with the benefit of hindsight. And I think can then look back and be like, oh, with what I'm doing now, would have been better if I got, X degree instead. So, I mean, I think it's probably fine, but I think if I were to go back, I'd probably do like physics or math or something.
Yeah. Are you a big like math girly?
Wow, I guess we're really going back to my childhood. Yeah, growing up, I think I was always perceived that way. There's a funny anecdote, which is that all of my school counselors in like middle and high school, they always told me like, oh, you're going into engineering or math or something, just based on your test scores. Like that's obviously where you're going to go to. And I was like in triple advanced math or something. Like I had to leave my grade to take the highest level math of the grade above me because my grade just like didn't have high enough level math. And so I would like leave like lunch early to like go to the grade above me's math class. No, so I think there is a perception from like counselors and people around me that I would just like obviously go into that. And then as soon as I transitioned, the narrative kind of changed. And I remember counselors being like, oh, you could really like, you could go into humanities or do whatever. And that was very funny to me because nothing about my scores had changed. It was like just that I had changed my appearance. And suddenly people were like, you could do whatever. You don't have to go into engineering. But yeah, I think that
That is really interesting. Just like, how visibly they changed, like you getting to live both of those experiences. I guess I'm curious, were there any other major changes that you noticed socially, I guess? Would you consider that like a social change when you started transitioning? Because you said you started 14, 15, which means you were still in high school. Like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I transitioned. I was wearing women's clothing for like most of high school. I think I transitioned halfway through my sophomore year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I definitely noticed changes, some like that, which like are funny and like very much speak to the fact that women are kind of dissuaded from certain roles, or men are sort of persuaded into entering certain roles in society. It was also funny. I noticed that like guys in my high school who had previously like jokingly flirted with me stopped doing that after I transitioned. I think because maybe like once you transition, it kind of makes it like real in a way where like
Yeah.
beforehand you're just like the effeminate kid who like guys are kind of like jokingly being gay with. And then after you transition, they're like, oh, if I jokingly be gay with you, people are going to think I'm actually interested in you. So you get like lots of funny stuff like that. I will say, in general, I didn't get like bullied or anything. I got like socially ostracized. Like people started not interacting with me as much. Like I had a really close friend who I'm still very close with to this day, but I told him that I was trans over text. It was like winter break. And he was someone who I had been friends with for years, like friends with in middle school, one of the people that I was closest to in the world. And he just responded with like a dot, like a single period. And
Oh.
I like left that for a little bit. I maybe like followed up a day later and I was like, hey, like what's going on? And he just did not respond. And I didn't interact with him, I think, for like months after that. And then kind of all of the sudden, he was back to being my friends. So it definitely took people a little while. And
Yeah.
some people more than others. I'm very lucky that he's now like, he continues to be a very close friend of mine. But yeah, that was definitely the experience to some degree with, I think, most people, was that it took them a little while and fewer people came back. Or I had fewer friends after than I went into it with.
Yeah. Am I allowed to ask where, like, I want to ask where to get like context for like if you're in like an urban area or like a rural area or like, but I don't want to
It was a
like,
more rural area, yeah.
okay, I don't want to like ask you to like dox yourself or anything.
I appreciate it.
Interesting. Given that we're in a more rural area, how did the school react to it? Or like, I guess what were the adult reactions? Like you mentioned the guidance counselors, but I'm curious if like your teachers were good or like just all the other, all the other facets of like a life as a young individual who doesn't have legal rights as an adult.
Yeah, I mean, when I came out to my parents, it was before Caitlyn Jenner came out. It was before a lot of people knew what trans was. I told
Oh
my mom
wow.
that I was trans, and she looked at me for a few seconds with this kind of puzzled expression. And then she was just like, "But darling, you don't have both parts." And I had to explain to her that intersex and trans were different things.
Yeah.
And that was just a time before anyone really knew what being trans was. And so, in this little rural community after I came out, my mother had lots of experiences where parents would come up and talk to her about it. People that she like didn't even know because they had heard. And
Hmm.
I was the first person to come out as trans, as far as I know, ever at my high school. And so it was a totally new thing that people were just not prepared for. And that experience of being so alien in an environment that has just never dealt with someone like you before forced me, I think, to get very good at making my identity and existence compatible with people who did not understand and were coming into it with a negative perception.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate?
I can. So I didn't ever do the thing where someone gets your pronouns wrong and you kind of berate them. I just didn't have the luxury of doing that because I wouldn't have anyone on my side. My only option was just to try to pass better. And I couldn't explain to people my experience in a way that would necessarily, they just didn't have the cultural knowledge to immediately get it. And so I had to make sacrifices and negotiate from a position of weakness. I had to understand that many people would see me as male. In addition to seeing me as male, they'd see me as just kind of like weird. And so I couldn't like demand things of people. I couldn't demand pronouns, but I also couldn't like demand access to like women's sports teams or bathrooms or whatever. I had to persuade people just through trying to meet them where they're at. And I think that mindset has really carried over, where like today I'm very cognizant of what gender critical and turfy and conservative people view when they look at trans people. I'm very cognizant of that. And I'm very aware of how I can present myself in a way that they're going to find acceptable. You know, I think that people who like don't like me would even maybe say that I'm like aware of this to a neurotic degree, where I'm kind of like, I've tailored some of my existence in such a way as to, you know, not offend these people. So that mindset of just being like aware of what people think of me, very aware, and trying not to step on toes has very much informed a lot of my approach to transition.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that. Would you say that you try to conform, for lack of a better word, to like I don't want to say right-leaning people, but the groups you mentioned I would primarily categorize as right-leaning. Um, like let me try and phrase the question better. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, are you living the way that you do in terms of like, you know, the way you dress or like the way you act socially, et cetera, because you want to like not step on their toes? Or is it because you like, I guess I'm asking, is it like fear-based or like, I mean, I guess, I don't know. All the emotions are kind of tied in. Sorry, I'm like confusing myself trying to ask this question, but
Well, I
you
think it's
mean,
difficult to fully entangle. I would say that from my perspective, it's more about awareness of how these people perceive the world and how I come across to them, rather than like trying to live up to their expectations or conform myself to their desires. And that's it's a tricky distinction, right? But here's an example. I think that the most important right that trans people can advocate for is the right to self-expression. Because there's a lot of people who I think are just not going to be convinced that trans women are women in any kind of philosophic or objective way, any kind of biological way. I mean, that's kind of a given, but there's a lot of people who are not going to be convinced that you should take a non-biological definition of womanhood. And given that, I think you position yourself from a much greater point of power to argue that you have a right to self-expression that is fundamental in some way to all human rights. And I think that when you tell someone like that, like a TERF who believes that trans women will never be women, you say, okay, I'm not going to argue with you on that, but I am going to argue that I have a right to do with my body what I will, and I have a right to do with my expression what I will. And I don't necessarily have a right to every space in society associated with women, but fundamentally, I have a right to my body. I think that's a much stronger argument, and I think that's really an argument that gets more closely to the core of what actually matters for trans women. So I think it's persuasive and it's more to the core, to the heart of the issue. And the reason I'd make that argument is because I have a kind of special awareness of what TERFs are thinking, what gender critical people are thinking, what conservatives are thinking. And I understand from growing up that, like, I can't convince everyone that I'm a girl. I can't do that, okay? But what I can do is I can dress and act and make myself look as feminine as I can so that when their brain reaches for a pronoun, it reaches for she and her. That's what I have control over.
Yeah.
And I can go to these people and I can say, listen, we both agree on some fundamental values, freedom of expression, ability to control what your body does. And then I can make that argument. So I don't feel like I'm beholden to these people, but I do feel like there's a kind of tactical way to approach negotiating for your rights. And it's informed by my experiences growing up in a rural area.
Yeah. I can 100% see where you're coming from. I guess one thing that I am curious about is that you said like negotiating for your rights, right? And when I think of like negotiation, I think, both parties are making concessions, right? And like,
Mhm.
I don't understand how you could negotiate rights because you either have them or you don't. And I'm not saying like, oh, it's a right for everybody to call me she, her, right? Like, I actually agree with you a lot in that, like, I can't control everybody. And I also have grown up like in a conservative environment. And, I don't know. I do resonate with like I don't care if you think I'm a male or a female. Ultimately, like I want to do this thing and like look this way. So like I'm going to. Is a better argument than like, oh no, you need to call me she her. But anyways, I guess my point is when you say like negotiating for your rights, like what do you mean? Or
Mhm.
like when we look at like modern examples of, certain states attempting to strip back the ability to get medication for adult trans individuals, I don't even want to open the child trans individuals can of worms, but like adult individuals, which like I feel like most people might agree on that like adults should be able to self-express and like have autonomy and control over their own bodies. Anyways, long-winded way of asking you like what do you mean by negotiating?
What I mean is that if we're being realistic, the only rights that you practically have are the ones that you can defend. Like maybe philosophically, you believe in some sort of God given, inalienable rights that are inherent to your being in some natural way. Personally, I am not of the opinion that there's some kind of, true fact of the universe about what rights are, or even, frankly, what like morals are. I don't know if that's a true fact about the universe. But what I do know is that the powers that be are going to defend your ability to engage in certain actions in exact proportion to your ability to negotiate that defense. And so when we think pragmatically, you can believe that you have a right to whatever. But I think what really matters is what you can get people to agree with you on. And I think you can get people to agree with you that you should have a right to do what you will with your own body and your own presentation. I think that it'll be much harder to get people to agree that you are a woman, or that you should have the ability to participate in like women's sports teams. And
Yeah.
so I think that you should like focus on these things. And to an extent, I think that like, unfortunately, when you focus on the harder things to argue for, I think you hurt your case overall. Like when you are dogmatically insistent that you control people's language and you control what they think of you, whether they think you're a woman or not. I think a lot of people are just going to outright reject all of your desires. They're not going to come to the table after you say that. So I think that you have to be pretty realistic with what you can get people to agree with you on. And unfortunately, I think that's a perspective that is born out of like having to interact with these people, like interacting with turfy and gender critical and conservative people in a way that if you grow up in a really liberal area or you live in a big liberal city, like, yeah, it's much easier in that environment to argue that like trans women are women and make that your battleground. But in the areas where states are trying to like roll back protections or roll back rights to adult transition, that can't be the battleground. So yeah, my perspective is ultimately, I think, kind of pragmatic on these things.
I can see where you're coming from with that. And I also do agree that like the urban versus rural like way of looking at things is like very different. And there's a lot of bias both directions, both from like urban people looking at rural people and rural people looking at urban people. So I do resonate with like the arguments do need to be different in some ways.
I think so.
Where do you lean politically?
I feel pretty homeless, to be honest. I mean, I don't think that right leaning people, I think there's certain beliefs that I have which are fundamentally, what's the word? That just will fundamentally not mesh with a lot of people on the right. So my perspective on transgenderism is one of these views. Like I think it's pretty important that people have the right to their body and to their presentation. Not everyone's going to agree with that. If you are someone who's quite religious, for example, the underlying theology is that your body belongs to God, not to you. And that to change the body is to somehow tarnish God's creation. And so you have to be very careful in the ways that you change the body. Maybe there's even like a teleological argument, like if you change your body in such a way that it promotes health and the purpose of living, which is maybe to like live according to God's word, then that's okay. But otherwise, it's not okay. And so I think that being trans and transitioning is probably like incompatible with that. I have certain views on racial equality, which I think are incompatible with the far right. Like I will just never agree with some of these people. I think it's pretty important to me that you're not racist. I think I'm pretty fundamentally against populism and some of the more like Trumpian elements of the right. I mean, I think it's a total personality cult, and Trump is a narcissist who is incapable of leading, and I think it's kind of ridiculous to be a Trump fan at this point. And so I don't get along with a lot of right wingers for this reason. At the same time, I don't get along with a lot of left wingers. I think that the kind of ultra progressive racial politics have been really disastrous for our country and social relations. I think that a lot of the left-wing arguments along transgenderism, totally miss the point. They get bogged down in these kind of philosophical arguments about what is a woman, which I think are ultimately not the most important thing to do. I think that they have, on the left, a lot of philosophically, I think the left wing is rooted in a kind of harm reduction and a real moral emphasis on just reducing harm for people. It's kind of like a utilitarianism, which, I don't know if we want to get super into the weeds philosophically, but it just does not work with me. And there's lots of like takeaways from that kind of moral root, which I think lead to bad places.
Like, how come you said, you don't, you said, oh, if I don't know if we want to get too into the weeds, but I would actually love to go into the weeds with you, Taftaj.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know how familiar you are with Jonathan Haidt's work, but he has a theory called moral foundations theory.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically argues that people differ in terms of five or six different moral axes. And so these axes are things like care, harm, hierarchy, fairness, equality, and I think sanctity is another one. And so these moral axes are probably pretty informed by personality, and personality is downstream in a not insignificant way from genetics. So we can imagine that over time, different people come to possess different groups of people come to possess different genes, and those genes encode for certain personality traits like conscientiousness. And those have overlap with things like disgust sensitivity. So someone who's highly conscientious in the personality trait, they're someone who is going to really care about cleanliness and order. And that seems to overlap with disgust sensitivity. So we know that disgust sensitivity is partially responsible for how should I say this? It correlates with views on xenophobia, homophobia, and sexism. Mm-hmm. So if you are someone who has a high disgust sensitivity, you're more likely to be xenophobic. And we can kind of imagine, like, you belong to a population group where your population group, your ethnic group, interacted with outsiders. And when they did so, those outsiders spread diseases to you. And the only people that survived were the people who are kind of xenophobic, right? And that's probably a successful strategy in some historical context, right? Like if the indigenous Americans were just far more xenophobic in the sense that they just like avoided European colonists, then maybe the spread of disease would have been slowed. So you can think of that as like, there's probably some evolutionary reason for being xenophobic that has to do with the spread of disease. But then you take that into the modern context, it seems like some people probably have genes that code for xenophobia that are based on this historical and evolutionary context. And it results in them being more distrustful of outsiders, more homophobic, perhaps even more religious. And that's probably not something that you can change easily. So another one of these moral axes that doesn't have to do with disgust sensitivity, or I think as Jonathan Haidt would describe it, sanctity, the desire for like purity and cleanliness. Another one of these moral axes might be care/harm. And so one of the sentiments that you see crop up over and over among the left would be this obsession with care harm. So a good example of this would be trigger warnings. Left-wingers tend to be very concerned with preventing mental harm to people. The irony of that is that we know that when you put trigger warnings in front of something, you prime people to be upset. So people actually get more upset when they're exposed to trigger warnings before reading some text. Moreover, when people don't engage with potentially harmful text, there's good reason to suspect that they become more vulnerable to that harmful idea in the future. It seems like when you are exposed to potentially harmful ideas or feelings, and then you come out on the other end and you survive, that develops a sense of self-resiliency and toughness. You might call this like anti-fragility, I think is how some people refer to it. I think that that's really important. And so I think that seeking out sometimes difficult experiences both on the individual and societal level, can lead to more health overall. But that also means more suffering in the short term. And so I think this is broadly politically applicable, that, if you set society up such that it doesn't allow people to suffer, you also prevent people from making decisions or taking risks that are ultimately going to lead to a much healthier, more robust, and happy society. For the same reasons that taking risks and exposing yourself to some dangers leads you to becoming a healthier, happier, and more robust individual. So, long story short, I think that fundamental relationship between avoiding suffering or being willing to experience it is something that plays out over and over again on the left wing, and is one of the areas where I find myself just fundamentally at odds with left-wing philosophy and perspectives.
Interesting. Have you ever taken a test that like positions you? I'd be curious to see like what your personal leanings for the like
Yes,
what did you call it? What's the name
there's a
again?
test.
Jonathan Hyman?
Jonathan Haidt, Moral Foundations Theory.
Heights.
Yeah. So you can actually take tests. I've taken them before. I think that I scored really highly in fairness, liberty, and then authority. So I think it was like in that order. So I cared most about fairness, then about liberty, then authority. And that is kind of a unusual scoring, right? Like I think that conservatives, they score about equal on all of them. Liberals tend to score most on care harm, but they also care about fairness and liberty. And I think that libertarians care most about liberty overall else. And so I actually have a personality, or I guess like a political impulse profile that is like a little bit different from most people, which is probably why I kind of don't find a lot of friends. Though I will say, for what it's worth, I do think that of any political persuasion, kind of like an old school or like classic libertarian is the closest to where I'm at.
And when you say that, I know there's a lot of connotations around libertarians as just like closeted Republicans, essentially. Is that what you're referring to, or are you referring to like I'm not necessarily. I identify as a libertarian for a similar reason, I think, but I want you to explain because not everybody will have the same context.
Yeah, well, you probably know this then, but the Libertarian Party in the U.S. has kind of gone through a tumultuous time in its party leadership, because there's something called the Mises Caucus, which has, I believe, taken control over the Libertarian Party at the national level. And the Mises Caucus is a lot more Trumpian in its perspective. It cares more about winning on these social issues. It's more willing to take a stance against abortion and against immigration in a way that more classical libertarians are not taking stances against, or at least are like kind of neutral on. And so that pivot over to like a much more Trumpian libertarianism, I think is something that like just doesn't resonate with me. But when I was like 13, my mother, she like went to a nearby college, and she like picked out one of the philosophy students and was like, hey, I need you to like tutor my son in philosophy. And this like guy who's tutoring for like, probably like minimum wage, he showed me this book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Nozick. And that informed a lot of my perspectives as like a 13-year-old, and really kind of introduced me to libertarian philosophy. And so I think I've taken that seed of ideas and it's spread into so much more in my political perspective. But at the root, I think, is this kind of fundamental desire for fairness and liberty within society, for well-oiled systems that make sense and can be understood and results in these outcomes that are fair and free.
I like that. I like your way of. I like the way you describe things. By the way, not to like. Sorry,
Thank
but
you.
I do like the way you describe things. Okay, now I'm just gonna ask you a bunch of questions that the Discord was asking.
Okay, cool.
So sorry if some of these are phrased a little bit. Okay, so what do you believe transgenderism actually is? And do you see it as a personal project regarding the self, an expression of a repressed inner identity, a mental condition, etc.?
Oh God, that is a that is a tough question. Oh God, I really don't know. I think for me, it is a kind of preoccupation with an aesthetic ideal and a desire to embody that, and all the frustration that comes with not embodying that ideal. And so I don't feel like there is some fundamental, innate, and unchanging identity that is like, I am a woman. I don't feel like that. I feel like I want to look like a woman. That is how I feel. I
Yeah.
approach transgenderism. And I want to like embody certain like feminine virtues. And I want to be like, delicate. And I want to have a kind of like wittiness and all of these kind of like classic feminine virtues.
Yeah.
That I want to embody in my life. And so that's kind of how I see it. And honestly, that is not how everyone sees it. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay if people have different approaches to things. But I also think that the fact that people are so different underscores a need for a more general defense of transsexualism that isn't an insistence on some kind of innate or even like maybe like divine feminine within people, like some identity. I mean, that just
Yeah.
doesn't describe everyone's experience.
I agree with you 1,000,000%. I also hate the like male brain, female brain arguments. I'm not sure how you feel about those, but I kind of look at them in the same way, where it's like, no, I have a female brain just in a male body filled with testosterone. But so I guess I'm curious, when you were first figuring out, or like coming to the conclusion, is how I'll phrase it, that you were trans and like coming out to your family, et cetera, what did that look like for you? Did you take a more I don't want to say traditional because you said like this was before it was really in mainstream view, right? So like how did you discover your transness, for lack of a better term?
Oh, well, I guess already talked about the article that I read. I discovered that people could be trans on 4chan because people were posting Bailey J. And I was like, wait, what? Like people, like guys can change their body in a way that makes them look like totally like a girl. And that like blew my mind. And I was like, hold on, I need to like research this more. And so I started just like Googling things. So yeah, which it's a very funny way to discover transness because in some ways it's like a very it's just like so classically teenage boy to like be on some edgy website and then you discover a porn star and then you like go read a fucking paper about it. So I laughed myself about that, but that's how I discovered transness and eventually came to the idea that I had to transition.
Had to? Question mark?
Yeah. So I guess here's another part of it is that I read this study and I was very convinced that if I did not transition, the dysphoria would just get worse. And then I'd end up as like a 40-year-old who really wants to transition. So my thought was like, okay, I either transition now or later. Those are my two options. And now is better. And so that I really pushed to transition.
And you kind of answered this earlier, but I just want to ask it again because we're on topic. If you like, okay, hypothetical, right? Time travel exists in this scenario. If you could go back and talk to a young you, would you encourage yourself or discourage yourself or like neutrally encourage yourself to walk through the door with the nails? To bring up the analogy that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely tell younger me to commit to setting up that Bitcoin miner on my laptop when I was like 12.
That would definitely be a good piece of advice.
Yeah, because honestly, that would impact my life probably more than like whether or not I do or don't transition. I would also, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think that like, I think on balance, transition has maybe like improved my life like slightly. But I go back and forth on that. Like, you know, some days I'm like, it wasn't worth it. And other days I'm like, it was worth it. Or other days I'm like, I'm glad I did it, but it was really hard. And I don't know if I'd do it over again. So I think what I would do, I don't even know if it would be like the first thing on my mind or like the most pressing thing to tell younger me. So it would be, I think I would focus on other life stuff. I'd be like, you got to really focus in school. You just got to like lock in. All right. And you got to apply for better colleges. Okay. Like it's fine if you take on some debt. Those would be the things that I focus on more than transition, which unfortunately that might be like a disappointing answer for people, because if you're beginning transition and you're really in the throes of it, it feels like everything in life. But when you get to be like 8 years in or whatever, it feels like a lot less important. And you kind of realize like, okay, you know, I'm probably about as happy as I was pre-transition, maybe like a little bit happier. But, you know, I don't know if it matters that much. I will say in a lot of ways, like, I don't think that my passing would be like that much better if I started a little bit earlier. Unfortunately, I think that like just genetically, I have certain features that are like common among women in my family that are like sort of masculine. So like a lot of women in my family have like very strong jaws and like large foreheads, which is just, that's just how it is. And
Yeah.
it's kind of a masculine feature, and it's worse when you're trans. But I try not to get too stuck up. Oh, you know what I would say? I would say if you're going to transition, you should stay up late more often so you stunt your height growth. That's what I would tell myself.
Wait, does that help? I stay up late every night, and I'm very tall, unfortunately. Although, like, I'm old, but I've always been staying up really late. Even when I was younger, I would stay up late. So
Your genetics might just be too powerful.
I'm
I will
just
say I
I'm
did
just too
grow.
Chad coded.
Yeah, I grew 4 inches on HRT, which that
Oh my
feels avoidable
gosh.
somehow.
Like estrogen therapy,
Yeah,
that is insane. I wonder if it's just due to the ages that you were like taking HRT.
it
Because
probably is.
you said
But
that
I'm
would
also
be around like
6 inches
16, right?
taller than both my parents. So
What?
I just got like fucked on the height thing in a way that like makes no sense genetically or even like hormonally.
Have you ever gotten a chromosomal test?
I have not.
I would be curious to know if you have any like androgens. I don't know if the right word is sensitivity or insensitivity, but I know that
Mm.
like there's this one androgen, like your body doesn't receive it very well, and then like you grow really tall. Like it's like tall, thin people, and then it's like a stereotype that they're trans, but like I don't know. A lot of things may or may not be correlated, as you know, in this area.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't really looked super deep into that, but it's totally possible that there's some like weird quirk of my genetics that makes me grow tall, because it is strange that I'm so much taller than both my parents.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Thank you. And then let me see. Let me go back to more questions. I got sidetracked because I wanted to ask a follow-up. Okay. Ask her, why are you pivoting so much away from leftism, and what do you see as your role in correcting trans communities? You already kind of answered the first one, right? Like you don't really agree with all of the excessive harm reduction like notices, if I understand it correctly. Like, and like you mentioned, there are a lot of negatives. But what would you mainly answer to the second part of this, and the first part, if I misunderstood your take?
Uh, what is it? She sees her role in correcting trans communities. I don't see my role as correcting trans communities. I'm just one person on the internet who expresses their opinions sometimes and happens to be trans. And like I said at the start of the conversation, people pay like attention to my opinion for some reason. And so it seems like they care a lot about it. I'm not totally sure why, but they do. And I just say what I think is true and people react accordingly.
Based, not gonna lie.
Thank you. It's true.
What are the main things wrong with contemporary trans culture which you would like to change?
Oh God. Things that bother. Okay. Here's what I'll say. Something I've been thinking about, which maybe I wish I had talked about earlier in this interview, because I'm sure people will only watch the first half. But one thing that I've noticed is that there is like a kind of narcissism, which is very pervasive within the trans community. And I see it in two ways. I'll preface this by saying, like, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trained in psychology. And when I say narcissism, I'm not diagnosing people. I'm really talking about like personality traits that are probably like associated with narcissism. But I don't mean to say that like people are literally narcissists or have
Gotcha.
NPD.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like I think that broadly, and people, of course, another caveat, people can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that there's like two big types of narcissism, which is like vulnerable and grandiose narcissism. And grandiose would be like more characteristic of people who are like, I'm the best, everything's great, it's so good. And then vulnerable narcissism might be like, oh, I'm uniquely terrible and my life is awful and nothing can be good. And I see both of these sentiments within the trans community to a very large extent. And I think that like you can kind of characterize them by like Reddit circle jerks and like 4chan doomerism. And
That's
both of these
hilarious.
perspectives are just awful.
That is hilarious, actually, because I can see what you mean. Like thinking about the Reddit trans communities versus like TTTT.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
But neither is good. Neither is like actually realistic or reasonable to be. So I would say to people like, you are not uniquely in like this awful position, and you don't have to like destroy yourself by constantly focusing on the worst aspects of your life, because pretty much everyone for all of human history has been in a worse position than you. Like they've starved and dealt with horrific diseases and deprivation. And yet these people, your ancestors, managed to live, to find partners, to love, and to find happiness in life with so much worse of circumstances than you. And I think there's a real temptation to view yourself as uniquely victimized, because in a way that feels good. It feels nice to feel like you are justified in your sadness. And there's a real kind of self-harm that people engage in when they view themselves as uniquely suffering. And I think you have to get away from that perspective. You have to get away from that kind of vulnerable narcissism.
Yeah.
On the other side, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, please continue. I can ask at the end. It's gonna be the same question.
I'll be quick then. On the other side, I think you have to acknowledge that like things are not perfect. Like, and you are not like, you know, the hottest woman on the block because you've been on estrogen for 3 months. Like, let's be realistic. Estrogen is not going to give you an identical weight distribution to a cis woman, at least not within 5 years, probably not within 10 years. And so you should just understand that, and understand also that that's like okay. Like, it's fine to not have estrogen be like this magical panacea that does everything and makes you gorgeous or whatever. Like, we can recognize that and still be like, yeah, it's fine to take estrogen and, you know, do what you want with your body, but let's be kind of realistic about what that is like, and not, you know, people get really defensive when you bring these things up, when you're like, hey, listen, it's not all sunshine and roses. I think because people kind of prefer to live in a delusion where everything is perfect and they don't want that ever challenged. So this is not true of every trans person. Most trans people are fairly reasonable, but I do see both of these sentiments within the trans community, and both are probably not so helpful.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm curious if when you say like you see them in the trans community, are you referring to like mostly online trans communities, or do you see this a lot in your like? Well, I don't know if you interact with a lot of trans people IRL. I would assume yes, but also like I guess I shouldn't assume that. Um, so yes, the question is like when you refer to trans communities, are you primarily referring to online trans communities, or are you also referring to like the IRL communities around you?
I'm referring mostly to online communities. I think that this exists within real life communities, but I think maybe not funny, the tragic thing about online communities is that they tend to amplify neuroses. And one person who can be totally reasonable in real life can be fucking insane on the internet. I mean, to an extent, like, I think this is true of me. And part of that is just like informational bandwidth and the noise associated with posting online, which is your full expression and perspective doesn't get captured. And that leads to this kind of toxicity and desire to interpret things negatively, and then also to like amplify negative perspectives. So, I want to push back on this negativity, but also like realistically, I'm a part of it as well. And I think being able to recognize when you are a part of it and you're contributing negatively is important. And I've certainly been guilty of that. And so, yeah, I think people can be totally reasonable in real life, and then they can go online and they can have like one bad day and they can say like, a negative thing, or,
Yeah.
they can come down on someone hard for something. And that's really easy to do online. And I think unfortunately it means that online communities tend to be pretty toxic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would resonate with that. And, additionally, like seeing other people be neurotic sometimes inspires neurotic thought loops inside as well. Like if you see people dysphoria spiraling, it's very easy to like attach yourself to that and like also spiral. Um,
Yeah, I think that's right. Or, yeah, absolutely.
no, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, like, sometimes you can see someone who's doing really well and compare yourself negatively
Yeah,
to
yeah,
them.
yeah.
So it
It's
goes
like the
both
same
ways.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Just that comparison is really often a negative thing. But I
Mhm.
guess one
Absolutely.
thing I was curious is if you think a lot of that is built out of, I hate to say like early transition, heightened emotions, but like you mentioned earlier with the autosexuality idea, there's like that period of passion, right, where you're like discovering this thing and it's new and it's fun and exciting, and then like there's a more like sustainable like companionship aspect of autosexuality. But I'm asking is, do you think that a lot of the negative aspects of the trans community are due to people in the like passion phase, or like because earlier when you were giving your example you even mentioned somebody who's like 3 months on hormones,
Mhm.
so like I feel the feeling I'm getting is that like it's early tranners, so like I want to ask for clarification or correction.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis that I had not really considered. I mean, like, if we take the autosexuality theory seriously, then there's an extent to which, like, if you criticize people early in transition, you're criticizing like someone that they are deeply and passionately in love with. And when you're deeply and passionately in love with someone, you don't really see the flaws. You're just excited for the present, and even for like this idealized future that you imagine with this person. And so, like, maybe that informs it in some way, the strong reactions and the heated emotions that people have. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, I think that like if people are similar to me and that they have this kind of like autosexual experience, then yeah, maybe that is a part of it. And that is like to an extent why people get so heated. It's always hard to generalize from your own experience, but yeah, I think that's plausible and something I hadn't thought about.
um okay, are you ready for the next questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I should probably get out of here pretty
Oh my
soon.
gosh, do
So
you have to
this was
go
like,
soon?
Yeah, I'll give you like a 10-minute, but
10 minutes.
yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh, there's like 7 questions left, but each
Okay, get to
question like
the hardest, most controversial, difficult
hardest,
ones.
most Okay, how about I read them and you shoot the one that you want, okay?
Okay.
Your view on the future of trans rights, how you feel about public coverage of trans healthcare, gatekeeping in the past versus now. Do you have any advice for incelibate men, and specifically like in relation to transmaxxing? Do you think incels should transition? Do you have any thoughts about incels, about the incel to trans pipeline in general, or how incel terminology has been spilling over to normies? What do you think about trans representation, more or less or different? Do normies know too much about trannies nowadays? Ask you how to get trans people online to empathize with the incel issue and men's issues. A lot of people are focused on incels here. Do you feel alienated from trans communities, and do you feel bad about that or not? And then, are you transmed? Do you believe that transmaxing can be defended and justified in the same way as transgender bodily autonomy? Okay, there you go. Which one do you want? Or you can even combine them if you want. If you think of like ways to answer multiple at the same time.
Yeah. Oh God.
They're a lot, I know, but they're in your channel. I made you a channel. I'll even pin you in that.
Love
So
that.
so
Yeah, I
you
think I'm looking at it right now.
okay, yeah.
Okay. Part of the problem here is that like I don't have super strong. I have strongly held values, but I don't have strongly held beliefs. So I feel very strongly about what I believe is like good and true, but to the extent that that's like applicable to the world, I tend to be like very cautious. Like I don't exactly know what is true about the nature of like trans healthcare. Like I'm not sure if taking hormones reliably improves mental health. And I think that's the general consensus from like academics. Like you can read these meta-analyses of studies where they will say the effect is positive on mental health in all of these ways, but our confidence is low, and also we just have a high degree of uncertainty. So that's really how I feel about a lot of these things, where it's like, okay, it seems like maybe there's like a slight positive, but I'm pretty unconfident about these things.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is like a general answer to a lot of these questions. I think that you have to be, in answering any of these questions, approaching any of these topics, you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to be proved wrong. You can't be dogmatic in your beliefs. You have to approach people who disagree with you with a high level of empathy and consideration, because that's not to say that like you are probably wrong, but it is to say that you could be wrong. You should approach every issue as if you could be wrong.
Yeah.
And I would say that like a lot of these things, like inceldom or whatever, they're things that probably seem really important when you spend a lot of time online. And they're important in real life too. But I think the perspectives sometimes that you get, and that I get like from some of these questions, I'm trying to answer this in the kind of controversial way,
Do it.
is that a lot of the people are sort of online or maybe like overly online with some of these concerns. Like, should incels transition? Honestly, you should do whatever you want with your body so long as you can take responsibility for the consequences. If you are not in the place psychologically or maturity wise where you can take responsibility for those consequences, you shouldn't make the decision. And that should be the determining factor. Is, am I capable of making a hard, difficult decision that may have long-term consequences? If you are, then I think you should be open to transition. And if you're not, you shouldn't, regardless of, whether you identify as an incel or whatever. And I think that's kind of an underlying principle there. I guess in regard to, do I feel alienated from the trans community? Definitely. But also part of that is just transitioning for so long. You're just in a different space mentally and physically than most people. So yeah, I think gotta approach things cautiously. You gotta, I don't know. There's not too much for me to say because I don't have super strong opinions on a lot of them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, are you transmed? That one's like an easy yes or no. So.
Oh, am I transmed? Well, okay. How do you define transmed?
I don't know. I didn't ask the question.
Okay, god damn it. Well, do I think that like you have to have dysphoria to be trans? No, I don't think so. I think that definition of transness that relies on dysphoria is kind of old fashioned. I think if you asked me like a few years ago, I would say absolutely you need dysphoria. But I think I've like lost that battle. And I think that when you talk about transness, I think it's probably important to distinguish between people with dysphoria and people without dysphoria. And so I try to be like careful about that in, my own writing. I'll say like people with dysphoria, and then I'll say transness kind of separately, because I think the reality is that lots of people identify as trans and have different degrees of dysphoria, or they might not even consider one thing dysphoria that you consider dysphoria, and vice versa. And
Yeah.
I think it just gets messy. So I personally try to be more specific and assume that when I'm saying trans, people are not necessarily picturing someone with a medical condition.
Yeah, I definitely can resonate with that. And then while we're just on the topic, I guess, with transmed, it's like kind of how do you feel about non-binary people or like specifically like, I don't know, non-medically transitioning? A lot of people just get sticks up their asses about all kinds of different things. So I guess I'm just curious if you have any controversial opinions about NBs.
I mean, I have the exact same opinion that I have for trans people, which is that like I think you have a right to do what you will with your body and your presentation. And I don't necessarily think you have a right to control people's language or thoughts. And so I think you should do whatever you want. You should take responsibility for those effects. And you should understand that not everyone's going to perceive you in the way you perceive yourself. You should make peace with that. And you should, if it matters to you that people call you they, them, or star or fae or whatever, like I think you can negotiate for that if you want to. But I don't think people are obligated to call you whatever. So you should also accept that that's okay. Not everyone will agree with you, and you should make peace with that.
Can I ask a controversial question about something that's chronically online? And you can tell me no. You can tell me no. It's quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think non-binary people can say tranny?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Based.
they can say it. Yeah.
Base take. Okay, I don't want to keep you for too long, but I do just want to ask, like, finishing up, was there anything you wanted me to ask that I didn't? Was there anything you wanted to say that you didn't get the opportunity to? Like, I don't know. Just was there anything on your side, before?
Not necessarily. I mean, we can always talk again if there's follow up.
Okay. Well, yeah, in that case, I won't hold you too much longer since you did want to run, but thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It was fun. I definitely went on for a while, so hopefully it wasn't too rambly.
No, I really enjoyed it. I really do like the way that you explain things. I can tell that you have done a lot of thinking about a lot of things, and like you're very articulate with the way that you phrase things. So
I appreciate that. I try to be, even though I get a little tongue tied sometimes.
yeah. Well, yeah.
Right.
Thank you so much. I will not hold you, but yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You as well. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.